Well, hi everyone. Well, here we are again, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, PhD in biology from Harvard University, and I'm Ken Ham, CEO of Answers in Genesis Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter. And we're here in episode number 23. This is our 12th week. Just to let you know, for the episode tomorrow, we will be taking live questions. Now, many people have already sent in written questions. I think we've got about 5 million of them. No, not quite that many, but we'll be taking your live questions. So we're going to use a special program. You can do it over Zoom, but we've got a special program we'll be doing it through on Sunday evening at the normal time, 7 o'clock. But in the meantime, you can still send in your questions by putting them in the comments here or sending them into customer service. We will collect all those questions. Now, this particular episode, 23, that sort of finishes it all and sums it all up, ready for the question time, the hidden history of the world. The whole series is being called The New History of the Human Race. We're much more closely related than you think, and so-called racial characteristics can actually come about very quickly. And, you know, when you think about it, Nathaniel, before I just tell them what we're covering in the topic today, when you think about it, with all that's going on in the culture about, you know, discrimination and racism and prejudice and all these charges against people and so on, many people don't realize, you even made the statement in one of your presentations that white supremacists could have a very dark-skinned person in their ancestry not that long ago, and they don't realize it.
Exactly. This has tremendous implications for the present so-called racial debate in how people identify, who's who they came from, how they view other people, what's foreign, what's different, what's related, what's not, those sorts of things. Tremendous implications in all we've discussed.
So today, what happened to the ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks, the Persians, the Egyptians? You're sort of going to sum up a lot of that up. Who did the Turkish people come from? Are Turks limited or linked to the ancient Middle East? What about the Mongols, Vikings? So what we're going to do is we're going to synthesize the latest DNA findings, and this is particularly being done through the Y chromosome research, which is inherited through the male. And with those DNA findings, we synchronized with archaeology, or synthesized, I should say, with archaeology and written history to uncover the tumultuous and explosive history of mankind. You know, you're a radical. You realize that?
This is a radical new history.
It's a radical new history. Nobody else is doing this. You're putting it all into book form, and it's going to be published in 2021, or better be, or there might be some tumultuous activity. But anyway, so Dr. Jensen, why don't you take it away from here?
And I want to say to our viewers, this is going to be much more than simply reviewing what we've already heard. I thought we'd conclude an episode with that, but in putting together all the pieces of the puzzle that we've been discussing and then lining them up, new things began to emerge that I hadn't seen before that are really provocative and got me thinking. And I think it'll get you thinking once we look at it together and say, wait, what? No way. So without further ado, let's jump into what I'm calling in this episode, the hidden history of the world, which, what have we been doing this whole time? Tracing the rise and fall of civilizations of peoples through the DNA of their descendants. We've started with people in the present, the DNA, the people who've survived thousands of years of history, looked at the connections among them, and marched backwards in time to see the connections between us and these ancient cultures. Can we identify them, overlay them? At this stage, I think it's worth very briefly hitting the lessons we saw in the first 6 episodes, because they get played out over and over again in living color, as well as these new lessons that we're going to be discovering, new ideas we're going to encounter along the way. Episode 1 was the history of human population growth, the idea that we all come from somebody, but go back just a few hundred years and there's a lot fewer somebodies to come from, a lot fewer somebodies for people to marry than today. And so this has implications for who's related to whom. This is going to show up in a big way at the earliest stages of human history. That's episode 1. Episode 2 was simply doing the math of our family trees. My family tree, your family tree. How many ancestors do we have? Even if you don't know their names, you quickly reach the conclusion we must be much more related than we think. Again, this is going to show up in a big way, especially at the earliest stages of history. It implies that, as we've already mentioned, so-called racial ethnic change can happen basically in a heartbeat. 4 or 5 generations, you can go from dark skinned to light skinned, from Asian to European, and any other direction you want to. You combine that with episode 4, the math of human reproductive rates, or I should say slight differences in human reproductive rates, and you can have one people group completely dominate another in ways you wouldn't detect apart from genetics. You can have, in theory, most Europeans be the descendants of dark-skinned peoples in the recent past, or vice versa in Africa, and not know it until you do the DNA. You have to see episode 4 for those details. And then, of course, the foundation for all of this has been episodes 5 and 6, looking at genetic clocks that exist in you and me. The fact, due to the fall, that inheritance is imperfect. So every time a new generation is born, and specifically we've seen in the Y chromosome, the male inherited DNA, that's the primary tool we have. That's where mistakes happen, apparently every generation. And so we can see how people separate when they come together, and the number of Y chromosome differences between any two people, between me and Ken, between me and you, between me and my father-in-law, that represents and gives us a sense for how long ago we shared a common ancestor. More Y chromosome differences means a distant ancestor. Fewer Y chromosome differences means a recent ancestor. And we've seen in this Y chromosome family tree of the globe, there's a lot more connections than we thought and ever would have anticipated from episode 7 onward. So let's now put these pieces together to see what emerges. And the natural place to start, of course, is the beginning. We've been unable to go to the pre-flood world, and this is an artifact of the quirky way in which we do genetics these days. There really isn't anything that's in DNA that's unambiguous a label of a mistake. There's some there's some indirect ways you can go about saying, okay, this looks like a DNA mistake, this doesn't, but they don't come with these signatures that say, this is a mistake, this was original. What you do is all comparative. You compare my DNA to Ken's, mine to an African, to a Chinese person, to an Australian Aborigine. You say, okay, where are the differences? And the vast majority of our DNA is identical. So it's fairly easy to look at the differences, but it's simply scoring match, mismatch, match, mismatch. That's how we go about saying, here's the differences, and we call them mistakes or mutations, here's where they're not. All that to say, since we do not have pre-flood DNA available to us, we can't go back with the Y chromosome to Adam and Eve. However, we can use other types of DNA to go back to them. And we can use the framework of Scripture through which to interpret it. And the framework of Scripture, especially for any skeptics who may be watching, gives us a means by which to create testable predictions. So God says, Genesis 1, he creates man in his own image, male and female. These two people, not derived from ape-like creatures, created by divine fiat, Adam from the dust, and Eve from his side, are the fountainhead of the human race. And I didn't spend time in this series on this, but I did spend an hour and a half with Simon Turpin from Answers in Genesis UK Europe. A few weeks ago, this is on YouTube, I think also on Answers TV. Just look up, was Adam the first human being? And we go into understandable detail, get into the weeds, but in an understandable way, the arguments people have been advancing, especially recently, against this idea. So if you've been involved in this debate, you've probably heard people talk about, well, genetics discounts the idea of Adam and Eve. There's been some prominent theistic evolutionists who've denied the existence of a literal Adam and Eve, and they've done so based on genetics, and they've become rather popular in this argument. It's penetrated seminaries and so forth. So in this episode with Simon Turpin, not part of this series, it's a standalone. Again, on YouTube, you see the title here on the screen, as well as, I think, on Answers TV, was Adam the first human being? We go through what does the genetics actually say, and what you'll find is a profound genetic confirmation of exactly what the Bible teaches. God created them perfect, without sin, and I would argue, without any mutations. And that, of course, tragically changed when they disobeyed God's command, rejected his authority, his rulership, rejected the perfect world in which he created them to live, and decided to do things their way. And the rest is history. Sad history. Brought death, sin into the world. Adam's descendants, all of us, are now sinners by inheritance and by choice. And this, to me, is then when the DNA clock starts, the sad marking off of the history since perfection. At this point, all of Adam's descendants, from my view, begin to inherit imperfect copies of the perfect Y chromosome God created in Adam. His male descendants begin to have their DNA corrupted, and that process has continued now for 6,000 years. Corruption, though, wasn't just physical, it was also spiritual, and it grew to such an extent that God had to judge the entire planet in the flood. So this is the third C, creation, corruption, catastrophe. And the only survivors were the 8 people on board the ark, 4 men, 4 women. I'm showing the men because we're looking at the Y chromosome again, the paternally inherited DNA. Noah has 3 boys, and Genesis 9 says, from these 3, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the whole earth was repopulated. This verse discounts any ideas that Noah and his wife had additional children who may have contributed to the human race today. This says, no, it's from these 3. So the Y chromosomes go back to Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and then ultimately back to Noah. That's as far back as we can go with our modern tools. And then what happened? We know shortly thereafter, Genesis 10 and 11, mankind, despite being a few generations removed from a global judgment, a global catastrophe, didn't learn his lesson and rebelled again. God had to judge them once again at the Tower of Babel and force them to spread out. Man's nature, of course, unchanged. And all pointing towards our need for a savior, for regeneration. So let's now begin to examine how this small initial population spread out, marched around the globe, and gave rise to the world as we see it today. I'm picking, just for sake of a nice round number, 2550 BC as the date for the flood. This is roughly a Masoretic text-based, long sojourn in Egypt-based date. And I realize there's debate over this. You have to pick some date just to have a discussion, so I'm picking this date. We don't have a strong position as a ministry on Masoretic versus Septuagint, these sorts of things. I'm putting this up here so we have just some place to start. I'm going to put Babel 100, 150 years after this. So at this point, this is flood. We've got 8 people in total on the planet, somewhere in the Middle East. Shortly thereafter, based on Genesis 9 and 10, confusion hits. The whole earth was one language, one speech, and they used that to their sinful advantage. And God judged them. I'm going to, again, just for sake of a nice round number, pick 2400 BC as the date for Babel and estimate around 1,000 people alive on the planet in total. There's 70 names or so in Genesis 10. It seems to describe these 70 men as the heads of families, the units that were dispersed. So 70 plus women and children of various ages. And I think this leads to a number around 1,000 people. Just a guess. So of course, God confuses their languages, forces them to spread out. Then what? So we've just seen that God judges the entire planet because mankind is depraved. They restart. Mankind is depraved. And in short order, he has to judge them again because mankind is depraved. Now, do we think, should any Christian think, that suddenly mankind is not depraved and they lived in peace and harmony for the next 4,000 years? Of course not. I'm going to guess that shortly after Babel, the fighting resumed. So the question is, at what point did the fighting resume? You have Nimrod, who's a mighty hunter before the Lord in Genesis 10. Is he just hunting animals, people? Who else is going about trying to slaughter their fellow beings? And think about it. God says in Genesis 11, look at what they've done, being able to speak to themselves. What's going to stop them from doing so much more? It implies that part of the judgment is to inhibit their abilities. So, as they spread out, do they all have the same amount of agricultural knowledge, technological knowledge, and other types of knowledge? In other words, are they going to be somewhat dependent upon other people? How do you grow corn again? How are we going to build a house? These sorts of things. And if they can't speak to the family they just got separated from, what are they going to do? Conquer them? These are the sorts of questions that are extremely relevant. Now, we mentioned in a previous episode that we can use a good first approximation model, population growth model, to take us from Babel to the time of Joseph's famine. Watch what happens at each generation, how many people are alive on the planet, and keep this in mind as we think about how far or how near people may have spread out after Babel. So let's fast forward 50 years. Using this model, there's 2,300 people alive on the planet. And now we're going to go in increments of 25 years. Now, I realize this is a good approximation for today's generations. People lived longer back then, but it still is a nice time point at which to take a snapshot and see what the globe looked like. So 2325 BC, there's 4,200 people. 25 years later, 7,800. 25 years later, 14,000. Then 26,000, 48,000, 88,000, 161,000, 294,000. You see how this is growing. 538,000. And actually, let me back up for a sec. This is probably the time at which Abraham was born. World population is small relative to today. Now we'll fast forward again, generation by generation. 161,000, 294,000, 538, 983. And finally, 3-4 centuries after Babel, do we finally cross the 1 million person mark. 3.3 million in 2050 BC. 2025, we got 6 million people. This may have been around the time when Jacob was born. And you think about the comments in scripture about how the descendants of Abraham being a small people when God chose them. Think about Jacob and his family relative to the rest of the world. 2000 BC, 11 million people. And then 100 years later, which is approximately the date for Joseph's famine, about 17 million. And I said in a previous episode, there were about 5 to 10 million men. Here's the approximate number of estimated total people, men and women. How far did they go? And who were they? Were they just like this? And to help us think about this, I want you to consider a city in close proximity to this region of the world. Today, Istanbul is a city in Turkey right about there. Istanbul has a population today of 14 million people. One city has 14 million people. I realize it's that large because of modern technology and such, but this is how big it is today. And just a few million people more was the total world population at that time. How far do they go? And again, just 3 centuries prior, there were less than 1 million people. 17 million is a decent sized number, but it wasn't that big just a few generations prior. It had to reach that point over multiple generations. And let's camp out at this date briefly, round it up to about 1 million people. My guess is the ancient cities were probably not 14 million people in size or 1 million people in size. Let's use, just for sake of argument, 25,000 people as a modest-sized city in the ancient world. 25,000 people as an approximate city size. If there's 1 million people total on the planet, that means it would have amounted to only 40 total cities of 25,000 people. Do you think there were 40 total cities spread across the entire globe? Or might they have been clustered close to the Middle East? 17 million people around the time of Joseph's famine, which brings us to the next sea caravan, people coming to Egypt. Based on the conversion of mainstream dates for the origins of agriculture to calendar dates, there may have been spreading beyond the Middle East. These dates right here, 2050, close to 1900, maybe out here in Papua New Guinea, perhaps not even in sub-Saharan Africa yet, perhaps not in the New World. Something else I want us to consider in terms of once people got out, what happened next, I want us to consider Stonehenge. There's some really intriguing things, mainstream science says, that take on new significance when we convert their dates to the biblical timescale. So Stonehenge, some of you watching in the UK might have visited there. Others elsewhere may have done so as well if you've gone to the UK. This is just from Encyclopedia Britannica. They say it was built in several stages. First one in 3000 BC. Of course, mainstream scientists don't like to talk about Christ, so they don't even talk about before Christ and that sort of thing. They talk about before Common Era. So this is a quote from the encyclopedia, mainstream encyclopedia, BCE. So 3000 BC, they say, is the first stage. Then they say the second stage for Stonehenge was 2640 or so BC. And here's what they say about the gap between those two dates. Except for human burials, there's no evidence of activity between Stonehenge's first and second stages of construction. What does that mean? Well, let's convert these dates to calendar dates. We know how to do it based on what we've discussed in previous episodes, the most recent 2 episodes. We've got this blue conversion curve. On this axis here are the evolutionary BC dates. I've given them as positive numbers just to make the graph easier to follow. And these negative numbers here also represent BC dates, but they're in the context of the young Earth timescale. And to convert an evolutionary BC date to a young Earth date, you just draw a horizontal line over and see where it intersects one of these 2 blue lines. And because of a little bit of uncertainty, again, we're talking 50, 100 years in the biblical chronology, as well as uncertainty in my biological calculations. And there's always uncertainty in biology. That's why we have to do statistics. You can do this conversion. So this 3000 BC date is somewhere between 2050 BC and 1650 BC, with an average that falls right around these tannish lines. These three tan lines represent the approximate range for the date of Joseph's famine. These tan lines out here represent the approximate dates for the flood. So 3000 BC puts you around the time of Joseph's famine for the first stage. Again, if you just take the average, it's about 1850, which put it after the famine, but you can see it's around there. The 2600 pushes the average out this way. It shifts further to the right and perhaps puts it after the famine. So on average, then it's about 1800 BC. Here's the intriguing possibility I want us to consider. Could the first stage of the construction have been done pre-famine? And the famine hits, they march back to Egypt, survive, march back out and continue. Could this be an echo of the famine? That's worth considering and exploring further. The bigger point I want to make is how much dynamic activity was going on at these earliest stages. I think we've all been conditioned to think in evolutionary terms where people arise in a particular area, they sit there and do nothing for indefinite, long periods of time. Eventually in the modern era, they begin moving, but they're basically sedentary and dumb. That's the default we've grown up with. But they're making pyramids, they're building Stonehenge, they're not by any means dumb. You look at how smart they were pre-flood, look how smart Noah was to build the ark. Now, Babel was, part of the Babel judgment was to inhibit their technological abilities. Look at what they're doing. God says, let's confuse our languages to stop that. Yet they're still going to retain intelligence. So what's to stop them from going out, coming back, being very dynamic in their movements, going out to Papua New Guinea, coming back? As we think about how far or how near they may have gone, let's make sure we're not thinking about this in evolutionary terms. These aren't dumb people. If they can move out quickly, why can't they move back? So if there's anything in your mind that says, well, I can't swallow the idea that people come back to Egypt. Well, if Scripture says so, that should be our final answer. And if there's a question of plausibility in your mind, let's begin to rethink and restructure our thinking in Bible-based terms and in light of the intelligence of the people back then. I don't see any reason to think that they should not have gone out and back and out and back in some sort of dynamic way. These aren't dumb people. If you look at state formation, which again I think is a marker of a relative marker of population size, you're going to have enough of a population size to say, let's have a ruler, enough of a quorum of people to say, well, let's make this guy our leader, or for him to take charge. Those civilizations that arise the earliest are in closest geographic proximity to Egypt. And those that arise later, i.e. post Joseph's famine date, are at the more far-flung reaches. So this to me suggests there may not have been anyone in any concentration in the Americas prior to the famine. And this type of map may have represented the world at that time, just clustered around the Middle East. And after the famine, then spreading out. The Ice Age is going to have an impact on this, depending on your model of the Ice Age. I've talked to Mike Ord, and he describes, and Larry Vardaman and such, and weather patterns may affect migration routes, may limit migration routes. All of this is at play. Very dynamic point in history. What adds to this dynamic nature is another issue we've discussed, conquest. And again, this is primarily a biblical point. We've looked at the history of Israel. Israel itself is a sad, tumultuous history of conquest, mixing, transport to other lands, and so forth. And if this is true for God's chosen people, who've got strong religious reasons to maintain their group, how much more would this be true, conquest that is, for other nations who don't have such strong religious, cultural reasons to maintain their group nature? And again, we're talking about a time in history that's shortly removed from the flood, shortly removed from Babel, two profound examples of the necessity of God's judgment on depraved human hearts. Why would it be any different back then? So now I want to think about anew the question of when did conquest resume? So if they're working together at Babel, God confuses and frustrates their designs. when does the fighting start again? Here, here, here. Does one family group decide to go try to wipe out the others? And if they do, that's the end of the line. One group decides, well, they've got something we want. Let's go kill them. What's to stop them? Where's the standing armies to resist them? What's going to happen to some of the lineages in Genesis chapter 10? Is there any guarantee that they would survive? Now, we've got some eschatological passages. Some of you have brought up to me in submitting questions. Those are all worth thinking about. We don't have a strong position on eschatology as a ministry, so I'm not going to get into them. But I want us to think about some of these nations who don't have any mention in eschatology. Would they survive to the present day? If men's hearts are depraved, they've just been judged twice in short order. What's to stop them from slaughtering and killing each other at these earliest stages? And if you slaughter and kill your neighbors at these earliest stages, you have a much higher probability of wiping out the lineage in its entirety than you do today when there's 4 billion people alive on the planet. You think about what it would take to wipe out a whole lineage of Indian people or Chinese people, or you name it, because there are just so many of them. Causing a extinction of a lineage is much harder now than it was back then, when it took many generations for us to even, for the world to even cross the 1 million mark threshold. That's something I think worth considering going forward, the impact of conquest at the earliest stages. At some point, though, people spread out, whoever they were. Now let's begin to bring in the genetics we've been discussing. We've talked about these various groups who have letter designations. Again, letter designations are just the arbitrary, if not ugly, way the scientists have developed to tell us where you are in the tree, to show you, okay, you're at an early stage versus a later branching stage. The major letters tell you early stage, then you get a number. If it's a later branching, then another letter, number, letter, so forth, as you march downward to the modern era through the tree. In 1800 BC, the major European lineage, I should say the major, what I've called the indigenous European lineage, group I, and the major Turkish lineage, group J, are one. They have not separated. If you look at the family tree, what would become what I'm calling indigenous Europe, and what would become the Turkish people that would be up here in Central Asia, then come marching back through the Middle East in the late era, in the AD time period. On the Y chromosome family tree, they are joined. So who were they? Some of the other major lineages that would play such big roles later in history. Q, which would come to dominate the Americas. R1b, which would eventually become the dominant lineage in Western Europe. R1a, which I'm saying has strong evidence for being a Mongol lineage. All of those are a single lineage at this point in history. They all eventually appear to become Central Asian. But what were they originally? In East Asia, O, which would become 90% of China, and N, which appears to be the lineage of the barbarians who would continuously harass them from the north throughout Chinese history, are also a single lineage, not separated. In India, you do find an isolated lineage, as if this is the indigenous Indian people. We haven't talked about India hardly at all. They are one of the cradles of civilization. They have the Indus River Valley civilization. They have 2 major linguistic groups. They have Indo-European, which, as the name implies, ties their languages like Sanskrit to Europe. But they also have Dravidian languages, which are mainly South Indian languages. So could this be the echo of the Indus River Valley civilization? Could it be the original Dravidian peoples? It's mainly Indian, and it's very ancient. In the Pacific, and this is something we talked about in episode 16, there eventually will be 3 major lineages, S, K, and M, Papua New Guinea, Australia, so forth. They're all one at this point in history. In Africa, there is a division in lineages, but some of the major ones are still joined. A and B are separate from D and E, but A and B have not yet separated. D and E are one lineage. Of course, D is not going to remain in Africa, except at perhaps a very low frequency. It's going to become the peoples of the great Andamanese Islands, the very dark-skinned people out here, and Japanese, a third of Japan, Right now, it's joined to E, and E, of course, is going to become, part of E, is a branch of E, is going to become the major lineage in sub-Saharan Africa. C has also differentiated at this point. I don't know where to put it, though. I know where it's going to end up. India, Siberia, Japan, Papua New Guinea, Australia. Where it starts, though, is anyone's guess. Let's also bring in now the locations of the cradles of civilization that are in existence at this point in time. I haven't put China. There's some debate over whether the Xia dynasty is real. Shang would be next and then Zhao later. That's just perhaps a century or two removed, not yet entering the picture, and of course nothing yet civilization-wise, state-wise in the Americas. Here's the major cradles. Something in the Aegean Peninsula, perhaps the pre-Minoans, pre-Mycenaeans. You have Middle East, like Sumer. You also have ancient Egypt. Could the IJ lineage represent one of these cradles? Could it be the ancient Sumerians or the Aegeans? Could the Turks have been derived from the ancient Middle East? Could H, again, be the echo of these first peoples? Could A or B or D or E be one of these original Egyptian lineages? What about these places where there aren't states yet, but there apparently will be or become some of these major lineages, like Central Asia and Papua New Guinea? And of course, there's the question of where C belongs and what's going on in the Americas. Here's something that I think is eye-opening when you add it to this larger context. At this point in history, there's only 21 million people in total on the planet. Let's distribute them to these locales, just in a very rough first pass, back of the envelope type calculation. I'm going to put 2 million people out here in East Asia, 4 million people down here in India, because there's already a cradle of civilization, 4 million in the Middle East, 4 million in Egypt, 4 million in beginnings of Europe, 2 million up here in Central Asia, 500,000 in Africa, 500,000 down here, and maybe there's no one out here yet of any significance. What's the chance at this early stage of history that it would have been hard to distinguish the Europeans from the Sumerians if they're part of an economic network? They're engaging in trade, marriage, plunder. How easy or difficult would it be to distinguish their genetic lines when there's so few people alive in total? Could the IJ lineage have any connection to these ancient civilizations? Is that the reason they're joined? Because there was mixing. That's 1800 BC. Let's fast forward 300 years to see how the picture changes and the story of humanity emerges. At this point now, D and E have separated. D may well be, at this stage, over in the Great Andamanese Islands. I'm going to move E up here for reasons that'll become clearer later. The AB lineage may be now pushed down into more of sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at mainstream accounts of the globe at this point, I've converted their 2000 BC date to 1500. In blue are the places they say you can see evidence for state formation, civilization: Egypt, Mesopotamia, Indus River Valley, and here in South America, so the Pacific coast. Here's the map again, 55 million people in total. I'm going to show you a population density map along with my rough back of the envelope calculations, trying to take this number and divvy it up, again, as is true, it seems, throughout most of history. Lots of people in India, concentration in Eastern Asia, some in Japan, some in Europe, some Middle East, not so many in sub-Saharan Africa. Historically, sub-Saharan Africa has not been a terribly population-dense region. There's concentrations here in Central America. Again, thinking about connections or differences among peoples, how hard would it have been to join the lineages of the first Europeans and the Middle Easterners? They're in close proximity, and the numbers aren't that big. Distributed among these lineages again, 8 million, 8 million, 16 down here, 16 down here, and these Indian lineages tend to be fairly isolated. If you looked at the genetic history of India, there's lots of people coming in, not so many coming out. Has a lot to do, I think, with their geography. 16 million here. The only joinings you really see are between N and O. People out here, people out here. Fast forward another 500 years. What changes? At this point, finally, I and J are separated. Now, This is still pre-Roman civilization, pre-Alexander the Great, pre-Persia. At this point, 1000 BC is roughly the monarchy of Israel, David, Solomon, and so forth. Egypt, of course, is present. You can think about some of these other ancient, major Middle Eastern civilizations. Are they reflected in I and J? Could the modern Turkish lineage have its roots in the Middle East? Could the Sumerians have become the Turkish people? Could some of these lineages up here have had their roots in the Middle East, and that the civilizations collapsed and they were pushed out this way? These are all questions to consider, questions the family tree forces us to consider. At this point, A and B have also separated, which again are dominant in the Click-speaking peoples and the very dark-skinned Sudanese. N and O have separated. You have, at this point, the Zhou dynasty, and you can see it spelled various ways. Of course, it's a Chinese term, ZHOU, in China. You see the separation of these lineages that form the major lineages in Australia, Papua New Guinea, and stay there, it appears, for thousands of years. If we superimpose the cradles of civilization, here they are again, Middle East, we finally have something in China and something happening in Central America. We still do not yet know what this ancient genetic lineage is, and future genetic studies will have to elucidate it. Just to give you a sense for the mainstream map of how this all appears, again, civilization concentrated here and here. We're not talking about much more of the map, even though there's a lot of geography on this map, because there aren't that many people there. When you think about history from the perspective of peoples, and I'm going to reorient this map because I've been looking at the genetic lineages in this orientation, this is how it plays out. And again, if you think of it in terms of absolute numbers, 69 million people total on average, rough approximation of 1000 BC, put 20 million there, 20 million there, distribute a few down here and here, 10 million in Middle East, 10 million in Europe. How hard could it be to join these lineages? Yes, I and J have separated. What are they? Who are they? And how many of these ancient peoples became very different modern ones? We've seen in the recent era just how transformed Europe itself has become through R1b, R1a, and all these other lineages that don't look like they're indigenous European. They've come from somewhere else. Why wouldn't that same rule apply at the earliest stages of human history? So here's these numbers superimposed once again in the context of these ancient lineages. 2 million down here where these lineages are, 5 million over here where we still don't know what the first American lineage was, 20 million out here in Asia, 20 million in India, 2 million in Africa, 10 million Europe and Middle East. What's going on up here in Central Asia? That's 1000 BC. Fast forward another 500 years. What's changed? What's going on? At this point, D is probably now in Japan. In Central Asia, Q has separated from the R1b, R1a lineage, but the R1b, R1a are still one at this stage of history. In Africa, E has separated into E1b, 1b, and E1b, 1a. It's an ugly mouthful, sorry. This will become much of North Africa. This will become much of Sub-Saharan Africa. And my guess is this will eventually become the Arab Middle Eastern ones. So they'll go out this way and then come back through the Islamic conquests. They seem to share some connection through perhaps ancient Nubia or Egypt. What's going on there? Who do they come from? Could the Arab Muslims have their origins in Nubia or ancient Egypt? Is that what became of these ancient peoples? C has also begun to distribute itself around the globe: Siberia, India, Japan, Pacific, so forth. If you look at a mainstream map of the political realms of the globe, again, there aren't that many places where there are major states. There's activity out here in China, India, not much in Sub-Saharan Africa, not much in the Americas, not much in Central Asia. There's Scythians up here, but the major empire of the globe is this Achaemenid or Persian Empire. Who were they and what happened to them? Could they have something to do with J? Could they have arisen, fallen, and then moved into the Central Asian area and become Q or R1b, R1a? Fast forward another 500 years. No additional splits have happened in these major lineages that we see today. The political map has changed. Rome is now the dominant empire here in the Mediterranean area. Parthians are over here, where the Persians were. You've got the great Han Empire in China, activity in India. And again, much of these other regions of the globe, the Americas, Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Pacific, you don't see much going on. And again, the reason seems to be because there aren't that many people there. That's what seems to drive so much of human history. Where are the people? Again, I'm going to reorient the map to how I've been looking at these lineages. Africa on the left, the Americas on the right. At this point, there's 160 million people in total. So if you try to roughly divvy them up among the major population centers, China, India, Middle East, Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, here. Now I think it begins to become harder to join these lineages. If there's 23 million people here, 23 million people there, what's it going to take? How many people have to be intermixing to have it show up as a joined Y chromosome lineage? I think there's going to be a lot of mixing that has to occur. The further you go on through history, as human populations grow, it becomes all that much more hard for these lineages to join. Now, I should mention these numbers I'm reporting are the average number of survivors who make it through this history. And again, these are rough estimations based on archaeological and written records. And if you consult different sources, you'll get different numbers. So keep that in mind as we talk about these. My point is, and my bigger purpose is, to show you the relative changes and just how few lived on the globe in the ancient times compared to how many 2,000 years after Babel and the flood, and the impact it has on the relationships that we see today. So that's AD 1. Again, we can ask questions. Which is the Roman lineage? Is it I? Do the ancient Middle Eastern Aegean ones become also the Roman ones? And does one group give rise to the next? We think about them as distinct. I grew up hearing these political realms as sort of popping into existence and then disappearing. But everyone's connected. Either you're completely wiped out or you begin to merge with other peoples. That's what seems to be the rule. So where's the echo of it? Now, 500 years later, what's going on? Who's present? What changes? R1b and R1a have separated. I'm going to move Q over this way because they're about to move into the Americas and wipe out whoever was here. Now notice we've gone through thousands of years of history and we still don't have a good answer on what's going on over here. Huge mystery still waiting to be discovered. I'm moving E1, B1b over into the Arabian Peninsula because in a century or two, the Islamic conquest will begin, marching through the Middle East, North Africa, over towards Iran and such as well for a time. The political realm of the world, you've got the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire has fallen to the Germanic tribes. The Eastern or Byzantine Empire is still present in purple. You've got the Sassanid Empire, Persian Empire over here. Gupta here in India. You've got different empires here in China. You're about to have the great Völkerwanderung, the great movement, migration of peoples, where the, actually this is already in the middle of that, where the Huns and others have come in here and wiped out what's going on. You've got the age of division in China that's going on, a very tumultuous time in history. Fast forward another 1,000 years, and there's major changes, if not mostly in the Americas. I'm going to draw these boxes here smaller because of all the activity that's about to occur, so we can see it easier. By this time, R1b has moved into Europe. Originally, it appears out here. Now, I say originally meaning in 1000 BC or 900 BC, excuse me, in 900 AD. R1b seems to have been here and then moved in. Where they were before that, who knows? Could they have been ancient Persians? Who knows? That seems to be something that still needs to be elucidated. Other changes include the movement of Q and domination, and apparently wiping out of whoever was here before in the Americas. Q becomes the dominant lineage there. J begins its march through from Central Asia back down through the Middle East. These are the Turkish peoples, displacing apparently the Arab Muslims, which were E1, B1b. If you look at 900 BC, out here you have a Muslim, an Arab Muslim dynasty or empire. That's going to change quickly by 1000 BC when the Seljuk Turks start marching from up here down through here and over this way. If you look at the population density of the globe, again, the major places where the peoples have been remain that way. India, China, Europe, not so much Sub-Saharan Africa, not so much Australia or the Americas. That's how things are looking back then. Fast forward another 500 years, the Black Death has come and gone. It's going to have a major impact on Europe. You're going to see J displaced. Mongols have come, moved them back this way, and then J is going to be coming back out. So R1A comes into Eastern Europe, does their world domination. World meaning this region of the globe right here. So that's why I'm putting R1A there. Lots of activity. I'm proposing may have shrunk due to the Black Death, and this is why so many of these apparently Central Asian origin lineages come to dominate Eastern and Western Europe. 1200 is the Mongols, and the aftermath lasts several centuries, depending on where you are. Several centuries in Europe, not so much in the Middle East. There's, of course, Tamerlane's empire who comes marching down through here after the Mongols. He seems to be Mongol origin as well. 1556, though, you can see the Ottomans have become their reconquest down through the Middle East. Russians are beginning to march eastward. This point in history is significant because this is when this huge spike in population growth begins to start marching upward. This has the effect of preserving many lineages. You don't see the destruction of many lineages. America's, of course, being one of the major exceptions, because once the Europeans arrive, there's this huge population collapse. By 2000, the map changes again. What you see is, again, the movement of J down here into the Middle East. R1A comes to dominate India through the Mughals. It has a Mongol origin. J even has some echoes in Europe, as does E1B1B. Europe becomes even more of a mix. Europe extends its fingers into the Americas, so that what was originally a Central Asian lineage, R1B, as was Q, Q went this way, R1B went this way, and then came across the Atlantic from Europe here. I is present, even some J is present through the Europeans, from the Turks, lots of mixing. The world that we see today, in terms of its peoples, are this way. The world that we see genetically, a great hodgepodge. That seems to have been the rule all throughout history, all the way up down to the present day. And as we mentioned last time, this is just the beginning. The history I've just shown you is derived from the complete DNA sequences of less than 5,000 men, and less than complete DNA sequences from more than that. And with nearly 4 billion men alive on the planet, there's so many more answers to be uncovered. This is the new history of the human race. But it's the beginning of this new history. We now have the tools in hand by which to fully explore this story, this narrative, in much more depth than we ever had. And we can begin to fill in these gaps in history that I've long wondered about. The questions of why civilizations rise and fall, it seems, out of nowhere and then without a trace. We know that's not true unless they've been totally wiped out. Genetics and the DNA of peoples around the globe today, within their cells, still holds the answer. It's just a matter of getting it and finding them out.
Well, Dr. Jeanson, that is absolutely fascinating. I've never seen anything like that before in my life, and you've done an incredible amount of research. Now, in episode 24, which is the final program for this, we're going to have a question and answer time. You're going to give the answers. I'm going to give the questions, right? I'm not going to give the answers. I wouldn't dare try. You've put so much research into that, and I've gotten a bit of an understanding from what you said. So much to study there. So what we want people to do, and we'll do this live actually for the final episode. So that'll be tomorrow night, and it'll be at 7 o'clock, same time as this one, but it'll be live so that you can actually ask your questions live. Now, we've already had a lot of questions being sent in as well. And you're going to go through those and categorize them. And of course, some are sort of duplicates, and put them together and prioritize them. So you can, in your comments as you're watching this, actually put your questions or send them to customer service. Dr. Jeanson correlates them all, and then we'll take live questions as well for the final session. That's what it will be, question and answers about this whole series. Now, you can see the entire series as one season, really high quality, on answers.tv. That's our streaming service. We now have over 2,000 items on there. It is absolutely astounding. By July 4th, 2020, we will have the apps for Roku, for Google, for Apple TV, and so on. Right now it's computer-based, but by July 4, 2020, we will have all the apps. So I encourage people to subscribe to Answers.tv. You get a 7-day free trial. It works out being only just over $3 a month US. And you can get it anywhere in the world. Now, we are also putting this series up on our YouTube channel. It's not as high quality as Answers.tv, but you can go to the YouTube channel and there it is free. But if you subscribe to Answers.tv, you get everything else we do. And we will have some conferences this year that'll be streamed through Answers.tv, and a lot of other unique programs and creationist nature programs and science programs, biblical programs, teaching programs, music for kids, programs for kids, music from our resident artists at the Ark Encounter and other people, Living Waters, Ray Comfort, some of his material, a lot of his material actually. So it's an incredible place. Just before we go, Dr. Jensen, you have a PhD from Harvard University. I was reading a paper from Harvard University that said humans share 99.9% of their genes, which means the genetic differences among us, we think they're major, but they're really small, because it means we're really closely related. And there's some other research that's been done, like with the Human Genome Project and others, that have shown that your outside appearance, the genetic differences that reflect in your outside appearance is only like 0.01% of our genes. And so even that, from that perspective, looking at overall genetics, shows we're all closely related. We're all one human race, but all these different people groups. And then you've shown through the Y chromosome research how all these different cultures and people groups can come about really quickly, in fact.
And have changed multiple times throughout human history. So it does show we tend to, as people, as depraved, sinful people, major on the minors and make mountains out of molehills when the differences among us are minuscule. It's just that it's what we notice. And of course, our sinful nature capitalizes on that and decides it's reason for discrimination, or elevating ourselves among others, or putting other people lower than ourselves, and somehow thinking one is superior than the other, when the biblical answer is we're all made in the image of God, equal before him, equally sinners, and under his just wrath, and in need of a savior. So the only races that matter are the born again one and the depraved one, or the unregenerate one. And I want to encourage all of our viewers, if they haven't done so, to be born again, to join Jesus's race. He's come to redeem for himself a new people. And these physical differences that we see, again, are minor and consequential when you look at them genetically. What matters is the state of the heart. And there we are all the same, equally under God's wrath, equally in need of a savior. And that offer is available to each one of us. And I would hope that our viewers would take that away as the most important lesson, and see that this entire spiritual narrative, which is grounded in real human history, is grounded in the book, whose history provides the most important critical framework for understanding all that's transpired on our planet. And the history based on that timescale, 4,500 years being the hero of this plot, is what finally opens up and unlocks for us the history of peoples hidden away in our DNA.
That is fantastic. That is excellent, Dr. Jensen. And, this whole issue of racism, when you build your thinking on the Bible, there's one biological race, that, as you said, to spiritual races. And that's what it's all about. That's what we need to be looking at. Which spiritual race are you in? We actually conducted a conference in 2019, the end of 2019, on the origin of so-called races, racism, prejudice, and so on. And we have a number of different speakers, 10 programs, and they're all going to be up on answers.tv as well as many other presentations dealing with that whole issue. And even things about skin color. Skin color is probably used as one of those bases for prejudice more than just about anything else, I think. You know, black people, white people. And yet, when you understand it technically, we're all basically the same skin color. It's a pigment melanin, a couple of forms of it, but there are other pigments, but we're basically brown. There's really no true really black people and no truly white people. We're just looking on the outside. You know, got to be reminded, God looks on the inside. Like when he sent Samuel to anoint the king, and he thought it was going to be one of David's brothers, and God said, oh, no, I have rejected him. For God doesn't see as a man sees. God looks on the inside, not the outside. Someone can look strong and handsome and look like they're going to be a big leader, but on the inside, it's your heart, it's your spiritual condition. It's what spiritual race you're in. That's what it all comes down to. That's what it's all about. Okay, well, we look forward to the final session, our question and answer time. And so get your questions in and be ready for the live program when you'll be able to send your questions in. Obviously, we won't be able to answer every question. We'll probably get zillions of them, but Dr. Jensen will do his best. And as a scientist, he'll probably take, you know, an hour on each question to answer them and justify every point. So I got to convince him not to do that and to try to dumb it down to, you know, like a minute answer for each one. I know that's sort of like heresy for you as a scientist, Dr. Jensen, but we'll have to figure it out.
Very good.
Okay, thank you.